Hello, everyone. My name is Erin O'Donnell, and I'm joining you today from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm a member of Awake's leadership team, and I edit Awake's blog. I'm glad to welcome you to the latest installment of Awake's Courageous Conversation series. Today's discussion is titled Vos Estis, 5 years later, and I will introduce our terrific panelists in a moment. As you know, Awake is a growing grassroots Catholic nonprofit, and the Courageous Conversation series is part of our mission to awaken our community to the full reality of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, work for transformation, and foster healing for all who have been wounded. We have a diverse group of people gathering here, including abuse survivors and their loved ones, lay ministers, clergy, and victim assistance coordinators, as well as others who want to listen and learn. I'd like to extend a special welcome to those of you who have experienced sexual abuse in the Catholic Church as children or as adults. I'm sorry for the ways that you've been harmed, and I'm honored that you're here today. Whether you've remained Catholic or have taken a different spiritual path, please know that you are welcome and valued here.
Amen.
Please take care of yourself in whatever ways you need to during today's event. If anything in the conversation is painful or triggering, please feel free to take a break and reach out to someone who can offer you support. We also have a list of simple grounding techniques that you might find helpful, which we will put in the chat box now. At this point, we're going to turn off the group chat feature so we can all focus on the presentation. We also ask that you turn off your video right now and change your Zoom setting to speaker view. Our panelists will respond to some audience questions later in the program. If you would like to submit a question, please send it to Catherine Hours during the panel discussion. You'll see that she has the word questions by her name in the chat box. So today's event will be recorded and shared on Awake's YouTube channel, but we are recording in speaker mode. So your name, video, and chat comments will be kept private. So now I'd like to set the stage for today's topic. This year marks the 5th anniversary of Pope Francis's Global Summit of Bishops on the topic of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. One result of that gathering was a papal decree issued in May 2019, known as Vos Estis Lux Mundi, which is Latin for "You are the light of the world." Vos Estis created new church laws and procedures for reporting and investigating sexual abuse by church leaders and for holding bishops accountable for cover-up and intentional negligence around abuse cases. Vos Estis requires priests and religious brothers and sisters to report abuse cases to church authorities, prohibits retaliation against whistleblowers, and broadens the definition of a vulnerable person. Every diocese around the world was also required to establish a system for reporting abuse claims by June 2020. These new church laws followed horrifying revelations about former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, who was removed from ministry and the College of Cardinals in 2018 and then laicized in 2019, based on evidence that he had used his position to abuse seminarians and children. In today's conversation, we'll reflect on the first 5 years of Vos Estis. Has it led to the accountability and transparency that is needed in our church? Where has Vos Estis worked? How has it failed? And what effect does all of this have on victim survivors of abuse? So now I'm honored to introduce our panelists and moderator. Welcome to JD Flynn, who is joining us today from Denver, Colorado. JD is editor-in-chief and co-founder of The Pillar, which provides news and analysis of the Catholic Church. He trained as a canon lawyer and is former editor-in-chief of the Catholic News Agency. He and his wife, Kate, have 3 young children. JD, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very grateful to be here.
Thank you. Great. So we're also joined by Barrett Doyle, co-director of bishopaccountability.org, which is an extensive archive of information about sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. Bishop Accountability has collected more than 1 million pages of abuse-related documents and posted close to 100,000 pages of documents online. Ann's co-director, Terry McKiernan, founded Bishop Accountability in 2003 to ensure that information about abuse cases was accessible and to keep it that way. Ann and her husband Bill have 4 adult children and 7 young grandchildren. We're very glad to have you with us today, Ann.
Thanks, Erin. I'm delighted to be here. Hello, everyone.
Great. So today's conversation will be moderated by Awake's own executive director, Sarah Larson, who is joining us today from her home in Milwaukee. So Sarah.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you all for being here. I am so grateful to you, Ann and JD, for agreeing to be part of this conversation. So we have a lot we want to cover today, so I thought we could jump right in. And I'd love to start with you, JD. Erin explained some of the basics about Vos Estis in her introduction. What else do you think it would be helpful for our audience to understand?
Sure, Sarah, thank you. I'm so glad to talk for a couple minutes about Vos Estis Lux Mundi, what it is and what it isn't. But before I do that, I just want to echo something that was already said, which is that just in sort of looking over the attendees who's here today, I see the names and faces of victim survivors who I know, victim survivors who whose stories have impacted my my own life, my own spiritual life, who have touched my heart and who have been friends as well. And I also see the names of people who are working in the church as victims assistance coordinators or safe environment coordinators to try to assure a better environment and culture and even spirituality of safety and protection in the life of the church. So I just really want to thank all of you who are here, because so many of you are have been have carried crosses and witnessed the carrying of those crosses and done so in ways that I think have been already transformative for the life of the church. So thank you so much for that. So Vos Estis Lux Mundi is I think best understood as a procedural policy guide, a manual which Pope Francis published in 2019, which aimed at setting a criteria for investigating allegations of either abuse or administrative negligence, in other words, failing to act when action was needed on the part of bishops and other leadership figures in the church. Vos Estis Lux Mundi, as I think most of us know, came as a response to the extraordinary outcry of lay people and clerics and religious Catholics and non-practicing Catholics all around the world, which began with the scandals of Theodore McCarrick in 2018, the Pennsylvania grand jury report in 2018, and then so many sort of subsequent revelations of serious misconduct of especially adults that we saw in 2018. At that time, it was clear to the American bishops in 2018 that they would need to respond. There was extraordinary pressure on them to respond. And talking with them, I can say that many American bishops themselves were genuinely shocked, saddened, and disheartened, and often demoralized themselves to understand the scandal of McCarrick's conduct and to understand kind of the patterns of administrative negligence and cover up that had allowed McCarrick to abuse people, minors and adults in the life of the church for decades. And so the bishops both felt pressure to act, and also there were some of them who genuinely felt that they needed to do something which would be similar to what they had done in the United States in 2002 to address the allegations of abuse of minors in the life of the church. So when the 2002 scandals of sexual abuse of minors in the life of the church emerged, which some of you lived in very personal and painful ways, the bishops were again under extraordinary pressure to act, and so they gathered for their spring plenary meeting in Dallas, and they drafted a document which would create both sort of standards of safe environment protection and protocols for investigation of priests and deacons, most especially priests who were accused of the clerical sexual abuse or clerical sexual misconduct with regard to minors. The protocols which were established in Dallas were not perfect. They were far from perfect, and they remain far from perfect. They're flawed in many ways. Their scope is too limited. Their scope often misses the way in which grooming behavior ought to be better identified and flagged in the church, the way in which clerical psychological capacity ought to be more frequently assessed in the church. And I think most people would say often the scope of the Dallas Charter and the essential norms, the two documents passed by the bishops in Dallas in 2002, often fail to protect the rights of those who are accused, to ensure that they have a due process. So many people have said that they have been insufficient both for victims and for people who face accusations of misconduct, and I think there's probably truth to that. But at the same time, it is also true that the Dallas Charter and the essential norms did create patterns of behavior in the life of the church, which have contributed, I think, to a safer environment for children now in many areas of the church's life than in 2002. Again, one act of abuse in the church is too much, and the gravity of any act of abuse in the life of the church is profound. And we shouldn't, I think, ever discount that. And at the same time, I think we can say that there are measurable consequences and some positive results of the things which were passed in Dallas. So when the bishops got together in 2018, they wanted to do something similar, and they developed a plan in the United States by which they would create kind of lay investigative boards that would look into allegations of misconduct on the part of bishops. But the Vatican put a stop to that. There was a very sort of dramatic moment at a bishops' meeting soon after the McCarrick scandal, in which the bishops were set to approve a plan that would create a lay investigative board to investigate allegations of misconduct on the part of bishops. And then the Vatican effectively phoned the USCCB and said, "Don't vote on that. You won't vote on that because we're going to create a plan at a global level." And the bishops of the United States, to their credit, were extremely frustrated with that. They felt that they had listened to the experts. They felt that they had consulted broadly with victim survivors, with those who walk with them, with those who help them in healing, and with people in law enforcement and other areas of investigation, and they felt that they had a pretty good plan. But the Vatican sort of disagreed and intervened, and so the American bishops' plan wasn't passed. But the American bishops still had a big part to play in the creation of the Vatican's policy, because Cardinal Blaise Cupich, the Archbishop of Chicago, almost immediately after the Vatican stopped the plan, floated another plan called a metropolitan model. And the metropolitan model meant that bishops who are kind of sort of usually just ceremonially in charge of a region in the church, would be tasked with investigating allegations of misconduct on the part of other bishops. And there would be a kind of a prior seniority list for the investigation of archbishops themselves if they were accused. And he said this was a better plan because it would be more appropriate, in his view, for archbishops to investigate bishops than it would be for lay people to investigate bishops. Take that for what it's worth. The Vatican liked that idea. They liked it very much. So much so that in 2019, Pope Francis promulgated a version of Cardinal Cupich's plan called Vos Estis Lux Mundi. And Vos Estis Lux Mundi sets a framework by which people who have concerns about either the immediate personal conduct of a bishop or the way he has handled misconduct or allegations of misconduct can make reports. Those reports can be considered in the Vatican. They can be investigated locally with consultation with the Vatican, and then presumably some action can be taken. Now, the question is, has any of that worked? And I think there's a lot to discuss about whether any of that has worked or not worked. And I think Anne has a lot of very good insight on that. But that should, I think, at least set the framework for Vos Estis is meant to do, and how it came about.
Yeah, thank you so much, JD. I can tell you're trying to fit a lot of information into a short amount of time there, and I appreciate kind of the overview, the big picture view, and then we're going to get into more of the details there. But I know, Anne, you've been following developments in church policy for a long time. So I'd wonder, one, if there's anything you would add to what JD said there, but especially what about Vos Estis strikes you as helpful, and what do you think is lacking?
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Awake, for having me. Hello, everybody. JD, I thought that was a fantastic summary. So fluent, and I have nothing to add to it. To answer your question, Sarah, so potentially positive changes that Vos Estis introduced. It for the first time outlined a flow of reporting, from every single priest and nun and religious in the world, close to 1 million of them, all the way up to the Vatican. Incredibly, this information flow hadn't been clearly articulated before, and it mandated it. So at least there were internal reporting procedures. That potentially could lead, if zero tolerance is enforced, it could lead to the ousting or sidelining of many, many child molesters in the church. It can also be a tool for containment, of course, and damage control. It can do just the opposite, but that's another issue. It also established that whistleblowers could not be retaliated against, and it also prohibited silencing of victims or other complainants about the content of their report to the Vatican. So those were all positive. Oh, and I think probably the most important thing is that it broadened the definition of victim to include vulnerable adults, and it criminalized sexual abuse of adults for the first time, or to my knowledge.
Yeah, thank you for outlining those things. And what do you think's missing? What do you think is not there or lacking in Vos Estis?
What's missing is that are just the crucial elements of ending corruption. You know, what's missing is mandated disclosure to the public. You know, disclosure is built into the definition of accountability. You can't say this is a step forward to accountability and say, but we're not going to tell you anything about it. That is an absolute contradiction and nonsensical. So disclosure is lacking. External oversight is lacking. As JD said, the American bishops felt tremendous pressure to establish lay involvement and lay oversight of bishops to some extent. And it's often, you know, noted that Vos Estis reduced this lay role to something that is fragmented, powerless, advisory only, and ad hoc. You know, a layperson can be brought in as an investigator, doesn't have to be involved, but can be if a bishop wants them to. And then their role ends as soon as the case is closed. There is no lay oversight board. In fact, it basically prohibits it. It makes clear that, you know, we are a bishop-led church and we are not going to let lay people judge bishops. I really see Vos Estis not so much as a step toward accountability, but in ensuring that accountability wouldn't happen. It has all the defects of the old process. It's insular, it's secretive, and it's rife with conflict of interest.
Thanks, Anne. I know we're going to get into some of the specifics of what that looks like in individual cases in a little bit, but I appreciate you kind of highlighting some of those things. JD, what would you add to what Anne said there about progress and limitations?
I think Anne's right. I think Anne's right, and about a lot of the points that she makes. It seems to me that what's good about Vos Estis is that it is a hook. The Holy See has said, the Pope has said, we care enough about Episcopal misconduct, Episcopal abuse and misconduct. We care enough about the abuse of adults. We care enough about cover-ups that we're going to have a process. We take those things seriously enough that we're going to criminalize them. That's good. What's bad about Vos Estis is the substance and the application of the thing. Anne's right. This Vos Estis has not, especially in the United States, been applied with transparency, and so something which was rolled out with a promise of transparency has been applied in secret. And the Holy See has taken great pains to keep, for the most part, Vos Estis investigation secret, with few exceptions, and to discourage diocesan bishops from disclosing the existence of Vos Estis Lux Mundi investigations. Anne's right that whistleblower protections have not been what the church had said they would be, and we can talk about folks who have faced retaliation for taking the church at her word with regard to the whistleblower protections that were promised in Vos Estis Lux Mundi. Anne's right that Vos Estis is very good because it identifies the sexual abuse of adults and the spiritual abuse of adults as a crime in canon law. The problem is that the Vatican is still very, very early in the process of figuring out what it will do with that, how it will adjudicate that, even which department is responsible for that, and even what the notion of the sexual abuse of adults means. And so there's a lot to be worked out. Part of that, I think, is just part of that is the fact that when you introduce sort of new categories of law and new sort of plans for to address abuse or any kind of criminal misconduct, there is a time in which sort of there's a lot of turbidity and things are a little bit shaken up, and it takes some time to get a good practice involved. And I can say that there are many, many people who work in the Vatican who are working hard to get good and just practices in place. But part of it is overcoming a culture of institutional self-protection. And Vos Estis Lux Mundi doesn't sufficiently kind of by itself overcome that culture. And many, many people who are well-intentioned in the life of the church, bishops, others who are invested in the life of the church, have been formed and habituated in a culture which sort of in which protection of the institution at almost any cost is the order of the day. And overcoming that, I think even for people who want to, has proven extremely difficult.
And I don't mean to zigzag, but I'll just build on what JD said, which is that part of the reason Vos Estis hasn't worked at all, it's the content. It doesn't have the elements required to make the Vatican and bishops truly accountable, but also Pope Francis himself in his actions has actively sent a contrary signal. You know, I agree that this can be seen as a signal that the Pope is saying, all right, abuse of adults is wrong. Bishops must be held accountable. But he has undercut that in case after case, publicly standing by even admitted abusers who are bishops. And what do you do? And the Pope himself has decisively intervened. If he were prosecutable under Vos Estis Lux Mundi, there would be a case to be made. So
several.
Yes. So we could talk about some of those, but what do you do when the Pope himself is openly, kind of sometimes brazenly, defying his own laws?
And Sarah, I'm so sorry if I can build on that too, or at least add one other thing that I wish I'd said, because there is another good thing about Vos Estis Lux Mundi that I think is really important, and it's actually reflected in this talk today. I saw a number of priests and people who work in the church who are here presumably of their own choice, of their own volition. I don't know a young cleric in America who isn't disgusted by clerical sexual abuse, a lack of episcopal accountability, and a culture of institutional self-protection and cover-up. I have met more and more clerics who are now the ministry class of the church, and some of them will be the leadership class of the church, who are trauma-informed, who have the experience of victims, who understand the gravity of these issues in the life of the church, and who are being formed, I think, culturally and spiritually to put the church's integrity and her care for victims and her accompaniment for victims and her creation of safe environments ahead of institutional self-protection. So if Vos Estis has done anything, I think that it can be said that the scandal over the past few years and Vos Estis being a part of that has set an expectation for a generation of both lay and clerical church leaders, so that I do think that we can look at Vos Estis, look at the expectations it sets, look at the way that many young clerics and lay people who work in the church take that seriously, and think, okay, that points to a cultural shift that will come over a period of time. The hard part is it takes a period of time.
Yes, but I would say the main cultural shift, wouldn't you say, JD, has occurred in secular society? I mean, I think the church is following that. And most of the bishops who we know of who've been investigated under Vos Estis Lux Mundi, it's been because of negative publicity. It's sort of the Vatican seems to continually be chasing the bad publicity and trying to clamp down and suppress it.
I think at the level of the Holy See, where decisions are made, that is often the case. Yeah, I don't know about I don't know whether the church is following secular society entirely or following on some fronts and leading on some fronts. And I want to think about that. It's a good question.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I do too.
yeah.
Thank you both. This is great. This is why I really wanted the two of you here in this conversation together, because you both really know this issue and are bringing different perspectives and different points of contact that you're learning from. So thank you for all that. I know that some of this discussion can sound a bit theoretical, especially I'm thinking of some of our audience members who might not be following this news particularly closely. And so when we're talking about canon law and the reporting process and the like, it can feel a little distant. So I'm wondering if we could take some time to talk through some particular examples of how Vos Estis has played out in particular situations over the past 5 years. And so I know I asked you both to kind of think of a few things, a few prime examples that would help people understand how these processes are being applied. Jay, do you want to go first with that and talk us through a few examples?
Sure. There's a couple of cases that I'd like to mention. One is an announcement that came earlier this year from the Holy See about the status of Archbishop John Nienstedt. Archbishop Nienstedt was the Archbishop of St. Paul in Minneapolis until he resigned under suspicious circumstances several years ago with allegations of misconduct and personal misconduct. And also effectively cover up. And he's been in a kind of quasi-exile since then, with his status unclear and investigation unclear. And there have long been sort of rumors and indications that Archbishop Nienstedt was under a Vos Estis Lux Mundi investigation, but it was very hard to pin down precisely what he was being investigated for, precisely who was undertaking the investigation, and what its status was. And believe me, we like chasing Vos Estis Lux Mundi investigations, so we were working as well as we could to sort of try to pin the details down and not succeeding. And then the Holy See announced in January that that a Vos Estis had concluded Archbishop Nienstedt would not be charged with canonical crimes, but he would face restrictions on his ministry as a priest. And a statement released by the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis, which I think has on a number of occasions been about as transparent as it's been able to be about their own sort of involvement in investigations, said that the Holy See had looked into decisions made during Archbishop Nienstedt's tenure, namely his administrative leadership, and allegations of inappropriate conduct on his own part, and that that investigation had been taken place by officials outside the archdiocese, that Archbishop Nienstedt would not face a canonical crime, but he had acted imprudently, and therefore he was forbidden from ministry in his province. He was forbidden from residence in his province, and there were a few other restrictions on him. Now, this whole thing was, if I may, weird, and it pointed, I think, to some of both the strengths and flaws of Vos Estis. Strength. A person who faced accusations was investigated. The investigation took place by someone who was outside of his own sort of immediate ecclesiastical orbit, and that sounds like it's probably a good thing. The investigation sounds like it was pretty detailed, since it came to conclusions which seemed like they were pretty specific about whether what he did was a crime or not a crime, what kinds of things he might have done or not done. Weaknesses. We got a very sort of limited bit of information that doesn't help potential victims of Archbishop Nienstedt to come forward, to feel like they could come forward in confidence, which doesn't help the church, those who are charged in the church with exercising oversight over clerics, understand kind of what the Vatican's thinking was in this, or which doesn't just do the simple act of restoring justice by clarity and transparency, which the Holy See has promised. So there was kind of an ambiguous announcement, but not transparency. There were restrictions. There were some decisions, but not enough information, I think, for anybody to really understand much more about what had happened than they knew the day before. And the reason that's a problem is because we know that transparency both helps to deter people from bad behavior and helps to encourage victims from coming forward. And that's why the church has said that she'll act transparently. And I think there was probably, my guess is, there were probably forces in the church's leadership who really wanted to be as forthcoming as they could be here. And then there were leadership figures who were putting sort of restrictions on how much information could be given. So I think this case probably revealed a bit of a tug of war in the church over what should happen. So that's one. Do you want me to give a couple others?
Yeah, you know what? Why don't we let you take a breath, and why
Okay.
don't Anne, why don't you share one, and then we'll go back to you for another one, JD. Oh, you're still muted, Anne. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, another U.S. Case, Vos Estis, was that of Bishop Howard Hubbard, who was one of the longest serving bishops, active bishops in the U.S. until 2014 when he stepped down. I think he was Bishop of Albany from like 1977 to 2014. So that is 37, 38 years. And Bishop Hubbard had been accused publicly of sexual abuse in 2002, 2003. And he had done, the by now familiar technique of hiring a so-called independent investigator, a retired US attorney who gave him a clean bill of health, who did an investigation, published a report, and said, there's nothing to see here. Then the Child Victims Act happens in 2009. And lo and behold, 9 people come forward to say that they were sexually abused they filed complaints saying they were sexually abused by Bishop Hubbard. Most of the allegations accused Hubbard of acting in concert with his own priests. Most of these alleged abuses happened when he was bishop, and he was, it ranged from fondling to anal rape. This is mind-blowing. The amount of harm done by a bishop who's also an abuser, it's really cannot be calculated. It was only after the 6th public allegation that we got public confirmation that a Vos Estis investigation had commenced. And we never heard what happened because a couple of bizarre things happened. Bishop Hubbard petitioned to be laicized. He said he wanted to get married. That was denied. And then he did go ahead and get married last August, and then he died soon afterwards, just a few weeks later in August. So, and at his funeral, Bishop Scharfenberger, his successor, said nothing about the suffering this man has caused. He said something like, I just had it up on my screen, I'll just read you a quote. He said in his homily that there was, quote, much to celebrate about Bishop Hubbard's life, adding that he was, quote, not an uncontroversial figure at times, but that, quote, priests are human beings. He did not address Hubbard's alleged victims or the bishop's admission of reinstating child molesters to ministry and not reporting their crimes to the police. However, we do have a hint in something Scharfenberger said, that the Vos Estis Lux Mundi investigation was probably concluded and found Hubbard guilty of something, because Scharfenberger said in August, when Hubbard stated in an open letter that he had gotten married, he said, while he's not, that Hubbard was not permitted to present himself as a priest or perform the sacraments in public, and he remains a retired bishop of the Roman Catholic Church. He said that the marriage, of course, had not been allowed. This speaks to a lot of the deficiencies of Vos Estis. What an inadequate outcome. The fact that we didn't know what was happening, the fact that Bishop Scharfenberger himself wouldn't have the conviction or belief or perhaps moral courage to address head on the fact that the idea that many, many bad things had happened under the tenure of Bishop Hubbard. Yeah, this is Vos Estis not working, not advancing accountability.
Yeah, thank you, Anne, for taking us through that example. And as I hear both of you talk, you're both kind of in the information gathering and sharing business, and the frustration of the lack of information in so many of these cases. I want to go back to, go ahead, JD.
There is no Freedom of Information Act in Holy Mother Church, Sarah. The closest I come to a Freedom of Information Act is Ann Barrett Doyle's website, I think, where you can get more information on more things than nearly anyone else. But
Well,
it's a real, we have learned in civil societies the value of transparency for institutional integrity, and that is, there are a lot of, I think, both sort of theological, practical, and historical reasons why the church is, extremely resistant to that. And one can understand why in places where the church is profoundly persecuted, in a place like Nicaragua, bishops would be, very, very averse to sort of opening up their files. And one can understand the way in which that could lead to, the persecution of priests and religious, and their incarceration and their torture and things like that. Here in the United States, where we are in a very different situation, we're habituated to the reality that open information creates better societies, and we want that for the church very, very much. And at the same time, I can understand why, from a universal perspective, it is a tough nut for the church to crack, to understand exactly how to be transparent. But I think most of the time, the reason she's not transparent is because she's sort of reflexively secretive, and even about things that aren't important, there's a sort of element of clerical culture of kind of keeping things secret when they don't have to be. That is not healthy.
And of course, the church could also publish, have a list of countries where the rules of disclosure don't
Are
apply.
dispensed or something like that. Yeah, that's a good.
Because priests and bishops and the victims could truly be in jeopardy.
Yeah, that's right.
There's not an endless list. For the most part, in most countries, I think it would be reasonable for mandatory reporting to law enforcement and for open disclosure.
Yeah. I want to talk about a Vos Estis in the United States that I think worked, and then a Vos Estis in the United States that kind of worked. And the one that worked is one that's not on a lot of people's radar, which is why I want to bring it up. But it's the case of Bishop John Brungart of Dodge City, Kansas. In 2021, in the beginning of 2021, like February, Bishop Brungart was accused of sexual misconduct at a time with a minor, as far as I know, at a time when he was a teacher. And he was accused of having, as far as I understand it, abused a minor, although the details were not immediately clear. A report was made both to the Holy See and to law enforcement in Kansas. The Archbishop of Kansas City did the thing he was supposed to do. He contacted the Holy See and told them he'd received this report. And the Vatican said, well, before you do anything, it sounds like the Kansas Bureau of Investigation is looking into it. Why don't you wait to see what they're going to do and what their conclusions will be? And so the KBI started investigating it. But the remarkable part about this is that Bishop Brungart stepped down from ministry. He said he maintained his innocence. He denied that he had done anything related to this allegation. But he said he knew that when priests were investigated, it was important, it was expected that they step down from ministry. And he said that as long as that was what was expected of his priests, he would do the same thing. And so he stepped down from ministry, and he was out of ministry for more than a year, for about 14 months, while the Kansas Bureau of Investigation investigated him, found that there was no evidence to support the allegation, informed the bishop about that, informed the Archdiocese of Kansas City about that. They informed the Holy See. The investigation, which I think took place far more thoroughly than a church investigation would have, because it was by law enforcement, resolved without charges or further investigations. And then Bishop Brungart went back to ministry. I think that's how Vos Estis Lux Mundi is supposed to work. The bishop sort of publicly accepted the allegation, publicly disclosed the allegation, took precautionary measures for the sake of victims, and things proceeded. And then there was a resolution to it, and that resolution was disclosed. But that took place entirely at the volition of Bishop Brungart. He chose to do that. I think the deficiency that points to is that there's no sort of expectation of that kind of disclosure, no sort of clarity on what restrictions are appropriate during an investigation, or anything else. So I would say the bishop did a good job with the investigation against him and the Archbishop of Kansas City. And that should be recognized as perhaps a pattern or template. But the problematic part of it is the part where that was up to the bishop, and a bishop who wishes to do otherwise can choose to do otherwise. So here's an example of that. The first Vos Estis Lux Mundi investigation in the U.S. is the investigation into Bishop Michael Hopner. Bishop Hopner was the Bishop of Crookston, Minnesota. He was accused and had actually admitted to, in some depositions, had admitted to pressuring a man in his diocese, a man who was a candidate to become a deacon, pressuring him to recant an abuse allegation. This man alleged that he was abused by a priest. That was going to lead to a legal settlement for the a legal judgment against the diocese. The bishop had the man over. He said, well, if you want to become a deacon in this diocese, you're going to have to recant this. And not only did he say that, he pulled out a letter which the man was expected to sign, and pressured him to do so. The man was, initially overwhelmed by this. He signed the letter, and then he later recanted, and he brought his allegation public. It was it was a tragic situation. I mean, an absolute tragic situation, and an evidence of an abuse of authority. So this was the first Vos Estis Lux Mundi investigation. All of that had been known before Vos Estis was promulgated, and then when it was promulgated, someone, I believe the man, made a Vos Estis Lux Mundi complaint against the bishop. The investigation took place. The Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis, which was responsible for the investigation, disclosed the investigation. They looked into it. They were very clear that they were looking into it, that they'd appointed retired law enforcement investigators to do the investigation. Lots of this seemed to check the right boxes in terms of clarity and disclosure. Now, we as journalists wish that there had been more disclosure than there was, but there was some, and that would seem like a good thing. But at the end, when it was clear to everyone what the conclusion would be, because there were audio tapes of the bishop admitting to having done these things. The bishop was nevertheless permitted to resign. And when he was permitted to resign, he offered some sort of vague and half-hearted ideas about his health. And only when, just about every reporter with an interest in this in the country flashed, headlines about that, the bishop posted something on his website sort of saying that he wanted to apologize in a vague and generic way for his failures of leadership as a bishop. And then he threw himself a big farewell mass at the diocesan cathedral, which he told his priests he expected them to come to, and it was all very garish and uncomfortable. What worked about that is that there was investigation. What worked about that was that the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis disclosed what they were able to disclose. What didn't work about that is that the bishop, by every metric that I can assess, committed a canonical crime. And rather than facing a Vatican prosecution for that canonical crime, he was allowed to retire. I think he bought a house in the Ozarks somewhere, and moved down south where the weather was nicer. He was allowed to do all of that with no canonical consequences, no restrictions on his ministry. He effectively got an early retirement. And while it's good for a bishop who admits to coercing an abuse victim into recanting their allegation is not in ministry, while that's a good thing, the circumstances under which he is no longer diocesan bishop evidence a sort of limited imagination of the Holy See to use her own laws for the sake of prosecuting someone who has admitted to wrongdoing. And so that's where I think we can look at that and say, okay, this is half of what Vos Estis Lux Mundi said it would do. And there's this idea that removing someone from office is the same as public accountability, when most of us, I think, would think that canonical prosecution is the same as public accountability, because that's what the church's own law says.
I really agree with that. That was a terribly insufficient punishment, given the really grotesque thing that Bishop Hepner did, forcing a victim to recant his allegation against a priest with whom Hepner apparently was close. He also admitted in a deposition, a civil deposition, to reinstating accused priests. But Archbishop Hebda did the right thing. Of course, Minnesota's been under tremendous scrutiny in the last 5 years, so you've got to keep that in mind. But also Bishop Cousins, the successor to Bishop Hepner, said he's not going to have ministry in this diocese.
That's right.
And you don't often see, I mean, I do think it's either part of the Me Too movement, or maybe it can be credited in part to Vos Estis, that more and more bishops are speaking out against brother bishops. Not nearly enough, but it's happening more frequently than it used to.
Thanks, Anne. there's so much I want to get into here. I think I'm going to move us on to some more questions. But first, I just want to mention for the audience, thank you to everybody who's been sending in questions. If you have something that you're hoping we can raise to JD and Ann, you can please send those comments to Catherine, who has the name questions in the box in the chat. So you can send those questions to her and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. We kind of dug into this a little bit already, but I just want to ask, as we're talking about all the ways that Vos Estis is not bringing the kind of accountability and transparency that many would hope for, would you say, and I guess maybe we'll go to you first, JD, would you say the problem is with the way the document is written, the way the structures are laid out, or is it a problem of implementation, or both?
Yes. There are flaws in the document. Pope Francis, issued revisions to the document a couple of years ago. Was that in 2022, Ann? Do you remember?
Right. It became permanent in 2022. That's
Yeah,
right.
and at the same time that it became
2023.
permanent, it was first an experimental document, and then it became permanent. And the Pope made some changes to the document, but there were some good changes. There were some good changes. The inclusion of sort of lay leaders of movements in the church who could be held accountable, and stronger rhetoric about protection of whistleblowers and these sorts of things. So there were some good changes, but Vos Estis bears all the hallmarks of a legal document which was written in a hurry by a committee. And it uses a lot of terms that in the Vatican are undefined or are only sort of being defined in the breach, or terms in which different departments of the Vatican have different definitions. And this is a really big deal. So, for example, the notion of a vulnerable adult, it's really, really good that we're talking about the abuse of adults in the life of the church. It's really, really important. But the Vatican has, the Vatican's departments have sort of differing definitions of what it means to be a vulnerable adult. For some departments, it means a person who suffers from, a profound intellectual disability or a profound psychological mental health problem, which kind of renders them unable to ordinarily function in a human way. But for other departments, being a vulnerable adult means that someone who is facing pressure or coercion, someone who is in a relationship of subordination. So you might be a vulnerable adult sort of relatively to a seminary authority, if you're a seminarian, in a way that you might not be a vulnerable adult in another context. So one definition is absolute and one definition is relative. And the ambiguity about that kind of thing has made it hard for the most well-meaning of sort of Vatican functionaries to sort of mete out exactly how this thing is to be applied and how they can sort of develop good processes. So there are real deficiencies to the document which have not been addressed even in its revisions. But I also think that the challenge is for the document to be applied by people who think that transparency matters, by people who understand or have the experience of the kind of profound spiritual crisis that many Catholics experienced in 2018, and who have spent sufficient time with victims to understand that there are many, many victims who love the church and who are coming forward not because they want to hurt the church, but because they need healing. And in many cases, they're looking for healing in the church which hurt them, which is profound. And I think in this culture, because of the litigation which happened after 2002 and the way that bishops responded to that, unfortunately, there can perdure a perspective or an attitude that abuse survivors are suing because they want to hurt the church, or they're suing because they want to line their pockets. When we who have spent time with victims know that most of the time, if someone brings a lawsuit forward, they do so with a great deal of pain, and they do so because they haven't been able to work, or they haven't been able to pay for their therapy, or their life is falling apart and they need some help. And so a shift in attitude which sees victim survivors as a part of the communion of the church, or as the object of the church's love, and which sees the profound impact of abuse in the context of the church on the spiritual lives of all believers, is sorely needed, I think, for a just application of Vos Estis Lux Mundi. And I think that is the place where we have not wholly kind of caught up in terms of the church, in terms of the church's sort of leadership and administration to what many of us in the life of the church have experienced.
Mm.
And
Thank you. I
I'll
think
add
that
sorry, Sarah, I'll just add one sentence, which is, I think in addition to everything JD said so beautifully, that many victims file complaints in order, as a public safety measure, in
Yeah,
order
that's
to
right.
prevent this happening from another child, in order to get their abuser's name in the public domain,
That's right.
because they know that there have been other victims. It is a true public service. You know, I know we want to talk about whistleblowers today, and we have some heroes in the audience right now who have done just that. And I would say the original whistleblowers, of course, are the victims. And none of this would happen without their courage.
Amen.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to echo what you were saying there, JD, about really what we're talking about is a change of culture in the church, which is something Awake really talks about a lot, is that ultimately policies and procedures only do so much if we have not changed our minds and hearts and the way that we think about and talk about these issues. So I appreciate you drawing attention to that. And is there anything you want to add about the question about whether this is a problem of what's contained in the document or the way it's implemented?
I would go so far as to say that the document, that this law was structured to not succeed in the way we wanted it to, number one. And I think I've probably talked about that too much. Number two, the implementation has been very erratic and inconsistent. You know, in Germany, we have Bishop Hess. I won't go into the details, but he was found by a church commissioned investigation to have breached his duty to victims and to the public in 11 instances. And he submitted his resignation to the Pope. And after some deliberation, the Pope said, or the Vatican said, you know what, we don't think it was an intentional, so you're fine. You're staying on as bishop, as Archbishop of Hamburg. Whereas they just accepted, or maybe it wasn't just, but accepted another German bishop, Bishop Bode's resignation for similar malfeasance. So there's just no rhyme or reason to who's being sanctioned and who isn't. And then I would add the sanctions are way too light. This is very problematic, and it's just tragic. You know, we needed this Pope, you know, where he was irreplaceable was not in all the issues that he weighs in on, although I hear him on those, and I'm glad he does most of the time. But where he was irreplaceable was in solving this problem. And I reject the idea that he tried his best and was blocked. I think he never intended really to do what was required. His heart wasn't there. And, you know, we see it in his record in Argentina, but also even after he passes this law, as I said, he's contradicted it himself.
Yeah, that's right. I agree with Anne about that. One other thing that I would say is that one other thing that has prevented a just implementation of Vos Estis is the weaponization of sexual abuse for ideological purposes. And here I would say that that's a problem for the media, for a sort of culture of large sort of Catholic donors. Here I would say that's the responsibility, you know, that is, I have seen that less from the bishops as from people sort of on the outside of the church who are very, very happy to push for the investigation of people who are on the other side of an ideological aisle. And if we've learned anything about abuse, it's that it knows no ideological bounds. And we have to be committed to looking at the people we agree with eyes as wide open and maybe even more wide open than we're willing to look at the people we disagree with. And sort of protection of people on this team or that team, or an aversion to looking into the problems with a person on this team or that team has prevented, I think, a good implementation of Vos Estis in a lot of cases.
I agree.
So there's two more questions I want to address kind of quickly before we get to the audience. One is, and maybe only one of you needs to answer this, but just, you know, it's been over 5 years since Vos Estis was promulgated, and we've been having a lot of conversations about the problems with the way it's been written and the way that it's been implemented. What do you anticipate will happen next? Do you have any sense that there might be any changes to the process as it exists now, or are we just going to be working with this current system for the foreseeable future? Anne, it looks like you're ready to jump in on that.
Well, yeah, but I bet JD actually knows what may be coming. Unlike me, he has much better sources. He's my source. But I would guess that probably if it's improved, it will be towards transparency. I would imagine, Archbishop Cardinal Supage and Archbishop Scicluna, before it was promulgated, after the summit, but before Vos Estis was promulgated, said, whatever we do, we have to, make it clear why a bishop is removed from office. And so it's very minimal. It's been test driven in Poland. They at least release a sentence saying, there's about 9 or 10 bishops who've been removed for negligence and sexual abuse of minors. It's just a one-liner, but the world hasn't fallen in as a result. So I suspect we'll see a shift to that, perhaps.
What do you think, JD?
the
Is that
document
coming or
isn't-
anything else?
Well, the document isn't going to change anytime soon. There's no appetite for that in Rome right now, and there won't be in this pontificate among the people who would be the actual writers of a new document. Everything, I'm glad you mentioned Poland, Anne, because so much falls to the nuncio. Poland is a country with a great deal of transparency because the apostolic nuncio, the Pope's representative there, has chosen to be transparent. If we see more nuncios who take the Polish model, we will see a better and more just implementation of Vos Estis Lux Mundi. If we see more nuncios who take the model that we have experienced here in the United States, we will not see that transparency. We'll see active opposition to it, lamentably.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I'm glad
The
you
nuncio
mentioned.
tells the bishop what the nuncio tells the investigative bishop what he can disclose and not disclose. So the nuncio holds a lot of cards.
Fascinating. I didn't know that.
That's helpful information, and I think it's valuable for all of us to be thinking about where are the places that change is possible and that could shift. So thank you for that. I want to ask just kind of one more question before we go to the audience, which is, we've talked a lot about all the deficiencies and the way this is not working in many ways. And I'm just wondering if you could each speak to if you see any signs of hope. That's something Awake is always trying to move toward or to do this work in a spirit of hope. And do you see any signs of hope right now? Anne, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I'll just be quick. Despite feeling pretty negative about Vos Estis Lux Mundi, I have lots of hope. I'm even optimistic. I just have an indefensible conviction that the church is eventually going to get it right. And I really want it to. And I think the primary area that really excites me is that we see so many more whistleblowers emerging, priests and nuns and occasional bishop, lay employees coming forward to the press. And Brent Shelton is in the audience today. His courage has been mind-blowing. And we'd still have Bishop Sticka sitting there in Knoxville if not for him. And JD, you were a huge help on that too. But I think that's where I see that's very exciting. We've tracked whistleblowers, and back in 2013, we published a list and we could barely find any. They now exist as the Catholic Whistleblowers Group, but now there's more than we can even track. It's happening all over the world.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And JD, how about you? Is there anything you would point to as signs of hope?
Yeah, I started, the first part of my career was as in diocesan administration. I was an archdiocesan chancellor, diocesan chancellor, these kinds of things. And I didn't understand a lot of this. And there are so many mistakes that I made and so many things that I did in my own career that now I look back and think, boy, you really didn't understand trauma, victims, power dynamics, so many things. I look at people who work in the life of the church now who have been informed by the experience of 2018, and they're seeking out to understand these things and to make sure that their dioceses do them well. Now, that doesn't mean they're always successful, but I do think that there are more and more people in the life of the church, whistleblowers, ecclesiastical administrators, many diocesan bishops, who want the church to be safe and who want to do the right thing when she isn't. And I think that is the sort of, at this moment, an inevitable trajectory of the community of believers, even if we have hierarchical deficiencies on some of these fronts, as Anne points out, while we have those. Yeah.
Thank you. There is so much more that I want to ask you about, and we've got some great questions from the audience. So I'm going to turn to those, and you can maybe just, let me know if you'd like to take one in particular. I guess this first one I just want to ask someone to respond to very briefly is there, there's one victim survivor in the audience who's asking, who was not familiar with Vos Estis, and presuming that they're in the United States, how do they make a report if they wanted to make a report through Vos Estis? Does one of you want to take that?
JD, you go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you go to usccb.org and then click on the button that says report abuse, you'll be taken to the Catholic Bishops Reporting Network and the Catholic Bishops Reporting Service. If you don't want to go to usccb.org, you can just go directly to reportbishopabuse.org, reportbishopabuse.org. If it's something that might be a crime, you should also call the police. And if you are concerned or skeptical that reportbishopabuse.org will work, or you're worried about whether the whistleblower protections will be real, I run a news site called The Pillar that would love to help you in any way we can. And so you can reach out to me. I'm sure Sarah will put contact information for us, but there are the official channels of communication. And then I think it is good when people speak with the media and speak publicly and allow these things to be investigated and brought forward.
And I would just add, if you do that, if you file a report through that portal, feel free to send Bishop Accountability a copy, staff@bishop-accountability.org. We, at the very least, will preserve it. And if it's based on information that's in the public domain and you're interested in having it published, we can explore that with you too. But it does no good just to throw it down the black hole that is that portal. It's important to somehow get it to a public level, and go ahead and file a report, and then put out a news release, tell a reporter, write a letter to the editor.
Send that report to us too. That's a great idea.
Send it to the Pillar.
Yeah.
You got to make it public at the same time. That's how you get a response.
And there are lots of ways to do that while protecting your own identity
And the victim's identity.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's right.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so maybe a good follow-up to that is there are a number of people in the audience, including several survivors, that want to know if you have recommendations, and it sounds like you've already made a few, about what a person should do if they have filed a report through the CBAR system, the Catholic Bishop Abuse Reporting System, and have received no response at all.
Call me.
Yeah. Okay. So are there any, so one basic question is, are there actually any requirements in the way the US system is set up or in Vos Estis itself to acknowledge receipt? Any timeline? Is there anything that's required? And then, what is someone's recourse if they are just not getting anywhere? So JD Flynn, you say call you. What else would you add? And then we'll go to you, Ann.
I would say, or call Ann, but I would say, look, we were very privileged to report on the situation of the Diocese of Knoxville, Tennessee, where there was profound dysfunction, which the Holy See was not paying attention to. If we had an impact in justice there, I'm grateful to God for that, but I'm also grateful to people who said, we are not being helped and we need to be courageous. And I was able to form a relationship with those people, and we were able to do, I think, some important reporting. That's what we exist for. I mean, we founded the Pillar to do that, and God has allowed us to do it. And I hope that we can do more of it, because more public accountability means more reform and hopefully more healing. And those are good things.
Anything you want to add to that? And I guess I want to echo the question. Are there any requirements that someone should receive a response?
You're supposed to get an acknowledgement, but it's all very vague about whether you're going to get updates or not. And most people who say they get updates say that they're very flimsy at best.
Okay.
I think I'll just reiterate that you can get a result once you go to the press, perhaps sometimes, and just be super determined. I mean, the most determined individual I know in this regard is Susan Vance, also the Diocese of Knoxville, who is posting YouTube videos, who maintained a website tracking Bishop Sticka's every move, who gave unqualified support to the brave priests like Brent Shelton, who initiated the complaints to the Vatican. So I think we each have to take a sense of responsibility for our own bishop. We are responsible for making sure that he protects children and discloses abusers. And if he isn't, do whatever you can, but make sure you make it public, send it to the pillar, and send it to Bishop Accountability.
And I just want to clarify that again, because I know there are people within the Awake community that are really reluctant to make their names public. So for those who are in that situation, there are ways to do this without disclosing your name, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. We always tell people that we treat those names with the confidentiality that a priest is supposed to treat the seal of confession. Like we treat our sources with that the level of respect that's supposed to exist in the sacrament. And I know Anne does the same.
Mhm.
And that's very, very serious for us, because we know that in the life of the church, retaliation can be a serious thing. And we want to help people help create a culture of public accountability. And so we do take that very seriously.
Amen.
Right. Thank you. So I think I want to pivot a little bit and ask, there's one audience member who wanted to kind of hear from each of you personally, and I would as well, as someone who follows your work, and just ask kind of how you balance within yourselves having how do we avoid having kind of a reflexive cynicism and hopeless, I guess, attitude towards all this with having a healthy skepticism and really following the truth? I guess many of us, I feel like, struggle with that balance. And we'd love to hear how you deal with that personally. Who wants to jump in on that first?
I will. I mean, I have no trouble with the healthy skepticism part. I'm good there. As far as avoiding cynicism, I think, as I mentioned before, I am fundamentally grateful to this church for, I can trace just about everything beautiful in my life to the Catholic Church. And I'm going to keep at it. But also, I have met among victims and other people fighting for change in the church, the most heroic people. I mean, it's just been a privilege. And so how can I despair when they are fighting, and the fighting, the struggle to make the church more lawful, more honest, more compassionate, is a way for me to remain Catholic.
Thanks, Anne.
Yeah.
How about you, JD?
Thanks, Anne, for saying that. Yeah, I love Christ and his church. The church is my mother, and the church is a communion of all of us. And what I've learned is that for whatever reason, God has called me to oftentimes be in solidarity with, or on the or working with, or aligned with people who have been hurt in the church profoundly, as I have been, as any of us who practice the faith have been in one way or another. All of us bear many of us bear the experience of love in the church, and probably all of us on the call bear the scars of wounds in the life of the church. And I think it is a privilege that has been a cross, a really heavy cross, to sort of help to stand with people who have been harmed, and to speak for them, to speak for them, or to help, more importantly, to help them speak for themselves and to give voice to their story. Like Anne, I'm privileged. There are people who I look at who are participants in this call who have profoundly changed my life because of their courage to share their story. But Newman talks about the consolation of history, that the church has been sinful in every century, and that's true. But I also think the premise of the church, the fundamental premise of the church, is that all of us are sinners. So it doesn't precisely surprise me that we hurt each other, but I also believe in the promise of the church that we can be perfected corporately together in grace. And so many people on this call, so many people in the Awake community have taken on the call to be a prophet, to speak to the place where God is present, and to speak to the place where God needs to be present. That bringing these things to light helps to bring grace to the place where it's needed the most. And I think it's a gift to do that. It can be, you can become extremely cynical. I like, like it probably is terrible to be my pastor. But I have been edified and sanctified by the call that Anne and I and Sarah share with so many of you to try in each of our own individual ways to speak prophetically about where God is and where he needs to be.
And I think in the that was a very beautiful statement, JD. I loved it. And I will say right now, I think God in Louisiana may be with the state troopers who are
Right.
confiscating the files of the archdiocese. And, you know, the breaking news in the last week is that the Archdiocese of New Orleans is under active investigation for child sex trafficking.
Yeah.
And they want every piece of paper pertaining to child sexual abuse. There's a court ruling. That gives me hope. The church eventually is going to be reformed because the prosecutors are going to insist on it, one diocese, one jurisdiction after another.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Thank you all. That's beautiful. Gosh, I'm just like really processing so much of what you've shared here. And I wish we had more time to get into more of this, but I think that's a good place to end here. And we're going to come back to you in a few minutes for some kind of closing thoughts about action steps. But I think we'll stop here, and I'm going to hand things over to Anselma, who is going to kind of lead us in our closing portion of today. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, JD and Anne. This has been an amazing conversation. So, hello, my name is Anselma Dulcich Ashley. I'm a theologian based in South Bend, Indiana, and I'm a volunteer member of the Courageous Conversation Planning Team. So, one intention for the Courageous Conversation series is for the conversation to lead us to personal action. So in a few moments, I will invite Anne and JD back on screen to share some action steps that they recommend. But first, let me share some important announcements. This is our final Courageous Conversation of the 2023-24 season, a wonderful season. We will take a break over the summer months and then return this fall with a fresh lineup of Courageous Conversation events. Later today, we will send you a follow-up email that will include a feedback survey and registration for part 2 of this Courageous Conversation, which will be held in the evening next Thursday, May 9th at 7 p.m. Central to discuss what you heard today in a small group format. Also, we suggest that you share the recording of this conversation with friends and colleagues who might benefit from it. The recording will be ready and posted in the next day or two. Please watch our website. So now let's turn back to JD and Anne for some closing thoughts. JD, let's start with you. Given all that we've discussed today, what personal action steps would you recommend that our audience members take to make the church safe for all?
Thank you. That's a great question. I ought to have prepared for it. I would say, the first step I would say to helping to make the church safe for all is prayer, of course, for victims, for church leaders, for people who are in positions of making decisions, and for people who know the right things to do and aren't in the positions to make the decisions. This work needs to be rooted, I think, in the Eucharist. I really do, and like rooted in the blood of Christ and his own agony in the garden. That would be first. Second is, I think we help make the church safe for victim survivors by making ourselves safe for victim survivors. People who have been hurt are looking for someone to walk with them, as Pope Francis says, to be accompanied with them, to kind of help them carry their cross. I was putting my son to bed last night, and one of my kids was having a very hard day last night, and kind of it affected everybody in the house. And my little son, who's 6, was sort of like asking it, how come we didn't get to play baseball today? How come we had to spend all day dealing with this? And I sort of said, well, look, in our family, we have to help carry each other's crosses. Your cross today was your brother's cross. And that's true, I think, in the life of the church. Our cross is our brother's cross. And so if we can make ourselves safe and available and accessible to survivors, they'll find us. I know they'll find us because they've find those of us who are in that position, and to know how to receive them and to know how to talk with them and to do some things with that, to speak to what we see, to say even in our own communities where we see things that are healthy and where we see things that aren't, not from a perspective, not like with the idea of like, let's burn it all down, which is often not well received, but from the perspective of we want this to be better, and we want to help make this better. And I think if we just get ourselves in the habit of speaking what's true, of being of avoiding the idea that like being faithful Catholics means sort of always being deferential Catholics, if we can sort of get ourselves out from that and realize that God is working in us and speaking in us and sanctifying us and empowering us by virtue of our baptism and confirmation, then we can begin to do a lot of good in the church on this front.
Thank you very much. And I love the way that you started with prayer and sacraments and you ended with prayer and sacraments with the community aspect in between. So thank you very much. And Anne, what about you? What would be your thoughts about, what would you recommend about personal action steps that our audience members could take to make the church safe for all?
I would say go to bishopaccountability.org, go to our homepage, and there is in the second row of the homepage, you'll be able to click on lists that have been released by bishops of credibly accused priests. Click on your diocese. A, has your bishop released a list? B, what do you think of that list? Is it informative? Do you know of abusers who aren't on that list? Do you see assignment histories? Do you see details about the allegations? Do you see photographs? It is extraordinary. 4/5 of the US bishops and many religious superiors in the US have released these lists. This is a huge leap forward, most of which has happened in the last 5 or 6 years. But almost every list is incomplete and not as informative as it should be. I would say start there. And if your bishop is deficient, do 2 things, or if the list is deficient. Write to your bishop and then write to your local newspaper. Write to the Pillar, write to National Catholic Reporter. The number one thing we can do is make our bishops feel that we are watching them and keep our comments public. I will say in the Yakima Diocese, 2 amazing whistleblowers from way back, Robert Fontana and Frank Murray, recently did file a Vos Estis complaint against the bishop, I think Carlos Sevilla, who had allowed a priest with child sex abuse images to stay in ministry back in the early 2000s. And it's not much, but lo and behold, they were privately informed that Sevilla had gotten a rebuke from the Vatican. And then they were able to, the church didn't make that public, but Robert and Frank did. So they got a tiny result, not proportional to the harm that the bishop did, but it was better than nothing. I'm saying that sometimes you will get a result from the church, but the number one thing you can do is make it public.
Thank you. And those are very actionable steps that individuals can take at any time. So thank you very much for that. And thank you both, Anne and JD, for sharing with us today. This has been an amazing conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, this is great.
Great. So as we close, the leadership of Awake is motivated by our faith to do this work. When we gather, we pray together. So we will end today with a short prayer, and we invite anyone who wishes to stay on to join us in our prayer. We know that there are good reasons that some may not choose to stay. If you'd like to sign off now, please know that we wish you peace and goodness, and that we hope to see you again soon. Now, as we begin our closing prayer, let us remind ourselves that as always, we're in the presence of God who is love. And feeling that presence now, we collect ourselves, knowing that listening is an act of love. Thank you, loving God, for bringing us together this afternoon. and giving us the sacred gift of listening to the wisdom and knowledge that we have heard today. May we hold each other in our hearts, each doing our part to cultivate love, hope, and healing that leaves no one out and no one behind as we continue to build this beloved community. Amen.